In the spring of 2022, the most valuable entertainment company on Earth lost $200 billion in a single night. Not over months, not over quarters. One night. The market closed on April 19th with Netflix worth $308 billion. When trading ended the next day, only $108 billion remained. $200 billion, enough to buy Disney outright in 2017 money, vanished between one sunset and the next. This was not a glitch, not a rumor, not a temporary dip. It was the loudest cracking sound the streaming era had ever produced, a fracture that ran straight through the foundation of what the world had been told was the future of entertainment. For more than a decade, Netflix had been the unstoppable force, the company that killed Blockbuster, the company that forced every studio in Hollywood to chase its shadow, the company whose red envelope, and later whose red N, had become the universal symbol of on-demand culture. Investors, analysts, dreamers all believed the rise would never end. The stock chart looked like a rocket that had forgotten gravity existed. Then, in one quarterly earnings call, the rocket ran out of fuel, turned nose down, and slammed into the ground at terminal velocity. The official headline was simple. Netflix reported its first subscriber loss in more than 10 years. 100,000 subscribers gone in 3 months. A rounding error compared to the 220 million it still had. But numbers have weight only in context, and the context was terror. For years, Netflix had promised the world endless growth. Wall Street had priced in eternity. The guidance had always been up and to the right. When the company finally admitted that the curve had bent downward, even slightly, the market did not react rationally. It reacted like a congregation that had just been told its God was mortal. Panic spread faster than any virus the platform had ever streamed. After-hours trading lit up red. Algorithms triggered sell orders. Hedge funds unwound leveraged positions. Retirement accounts that had never heard the word Netflix suddenly owned less tomorrow than they did yesterday. By morning, the damage was biblical. $200 billion erased as cleanly as chalk from a board. But the real story was never the number. It was never the subscriber count or the stock price or the analyst tears on CNBC. The real story was how an empire that looked invincible from the outside had been hollowing out for years, and how no one in power wanted to admit it until the walls finally collapsed. To understand how Netflix lost $200 billion overnight, you have to go back, not to 2022, not even to the pandemic boom, but to the cold January morning in 1998, when a former software marketer named Reed Hastings mailed a single DVD from a post office in Santa Cruz, California. That envelope was the seed. Everything that burned in 2022 had already been planted that day. The ambition. The obsession with growth. The belief that if you moved fast enough, the rules of gravity would never apply to you. Hastings did not invent DVD by mail because he loved movies. He did it because he had been charged a $40 late fee for Apollo 13 at Blockbuster and decided the entire rental model was broken. That anger became a religion. Eliminate late fees, eliminate due dates, eliminate stores, give the customer everything, immediately, forever. The pitch was so clean, so obviously superior, that within 10 years, Blockbuster was bankrupt and Netflix was mailing 30 million red envelopes a month. But even then, Hastings was looking past the horizon. He saw broadband spreading across America like spilled ink. He saw living rooms about to be colonized by something bigger than television had ever been. In 2007, with DVD subscriptions still exploding, Netflix quietly launched streaming. Almost no one noticed. The library was tiny, the quality was potato, yet Hastings poured money into servers and licensing the way other CEOs poured money into private jets. He was not managing a company. He was preparing for conquest. By 2013, the conquest had a name: House of Cards, Netflix's first original series. The moment the industry realized the disruptor had become the studio, $100 million for 2 seasons of a political drama released all at once with no pilot, no test screenings, no network notes. The old guard laughed until the reviews came in, until Kevin Spacey won a Golden Globe, until binge watching entered the dictionary. From that point forward, the story was told the same way everywhere. Netflix was inevitable. Netflix was the future. Netflix could not be stopped.
Every earnings call became a coronation. Every subscriber milestone became proof of manifest destiny. 50 million, 100 million, 150 million. The world ran out of new countries, and Netflix started translating its interface into languages most employees had never heard spoken. Money poured in like floodwater. The stock split. Split again. Billionaires were minted overnight. Programmers in Los Gatos became multimillionaires while still in their 20s. The company built a license to print money by borrowing billions to make content no one had asked for, betting the next quarter would always be bigger than the last. It was the greatest growth story of the digital age. And beneath the triumph, cracks were already forming. Tiny, invisible to the naked eye, but growing. The first warning came in 2011 when Netflix tried to split the DVD and streaming businesses into two brands. The backlash was instant and ferocious. The stock fell 50% in weeks. Hastings reversed course, apologized, survived. But the message was clear. The audience would forgive almost anything except the appearance of taking something away. The second warning came in 2019 when Disney pulled its library to launch Disney+. The third came in 2020 when Warner
Bros. Announced day-and-date theatrical releases on HBO Max. The fourth came when Apple, Amazon, Paramount, Comcast, and Discovery all decided the only way to survive Netflix was to become Netflix. But the market ignored the warnings. The pandemic arrived and everyone stayed home and subscribed to everything at once. Netflix added 36 million customers in 2020 alone. The rocket kept climbing. The borrowing kept growing. The content budget ballooned past $17 billion a year. No one asked what would happen when the world opened again. No one asked what would happen when every studio finally had its own app. No one asked how long you could lose $10 billion a year and still call it winning. They were about to find out. The night of April 19th, 2022 did not feel historic while it was happening. It felt like the end of the world, and in many ways, it was. The morning after the crash, the headlines wrote themselves. Netflix meltdown. The end of the streaming wars. Peak TV is dead. Pundits who had spent years calling Reed Hastings a genius now called him yesterday's news before the coffee got cold. The stock chart looked like a heart monitor flatlining. Employees in Los Gatos walked into the office past security guards who suddenly seemed to be watching them instead of protecting them. But the truth is, the $200 billion wipeout was never about one bad quarter. It was the moment the market finally priced in a future it had spent years refusing to imagine. A future where growth was no longer guaranteed. A future where the pandemic sugar high was over. A future where Netflix was no longer the only game in town, but just another app fighting for space on an increasingly crowded remote. To understand how completely the landscape had shifted, you have to rewind to the peak. January 2020. Netflix closed the decade with 167 million subscribers and a market cap pushing $200 billion. The company was spending $15 billion a year on content, more than the GDP of Iceland. Original series were premiering every single week. The algorithm was so confident it knew you better than your therapist that it was greenlighting shows based on 3 clicks of user behavior. Wall Street had a phrase for this period, the Netflix put. No matter how much debt the company took on, no matter how insane the spending became, the stock only went up. Investors treated Netflix the way medieval peasants treated the church, untouchable, eternal, divinely ordained. Analysts issued price targets that kept getting higher even as the balance sheet got uglier. The company was losing money every year, sometimes $10 billion or more, and the market rewarded it with a higher multiple. It was the purest expression of growth at all costs religion the tech world has ever produced. Burn cash today, own the living room tomorrow. The tomorrow never had to arrive because the story was so perfect that believing it was enough. Then the pandemic hit, and for 18 months, the story looked bulletproof. Cinemas closed, sports vanished. People trapped at home did the only thing they could. They subscribed to everything. Netflix added more customers in 2020 and 2021 than it had in the previous 4 years combined. The world needed distraction, and Netflix became the global morphine drip. Inside the company, the mood was euphoric, almost messianic. Executives spoke openly about reaching 1 billion subscribers. They drew maps of every country on Earth and colored in the ones they had already conquered. They told employees the mission was no longer to beat Blockbuster. The mission was to become the default utility of human boredom. When you felt nothing, you opened Netflix. When you felt everything, you opened Netflix. Birth, death, love, war, every moment of the human experience now had a playlist. And for a little while, it worked. The rocket kept roaring upward. The debt kept growing, but who cared when the stock was splitting again? But empires built on the assumption of eternal expansion have a fatal weakness. They cannot imagine contraction. Netflix had optimized every variable for a world in which there were always more homes to conquer, more bandwidth to exploit, more credit cards to charge. The company had never had to compete in a mature market. It had never had to fight for share instead of just taking it. It had never had to worry about churn, because churn had always been drowned out by the flood of new subscribers. Then, slowly at first, the flood stopped. It began in North America. The market Netflix had saturated first was now saturated completely. There were no more couch potatoes left to convert. Every household that wanted Netflix already had it. Growth in the United States and Canada fell from double digits to low single digits to zero. The company shifted its gaze overseas, to India, to Africa, to Latin America, places where hundreds of millions of people were finally getting reliable internet. But those markets came with a problem the algorithm had never been trained to solve. They were poor. The average Indian consumer could not pay $15 a month. Many could not pay $5. Netflix experimented with mobile-only plans, with cheaper tiers, with local content shot on shoestring budgets. The subscriber numbers kept climbing, but the revenue per user collapsed. The company was adding bodies the way a drowning man adds water. Meanwhile, the competition finally woke up. Disney Plus launched in November 2019 and hit 10 million subscribers on day one. HBO Max, Peacock, Paramount Plus, Apple TV Plus, Discovery Plus, every legacy studio that had spent years feeding Netflix its best movies suddenly wanted them back. The content arms race went nuclear. $17 billion from Netflix, $15 billion from Disney, $10 billion from Amazon. The math only worked if someone eventually blinked. Netflix never blinked. It kept borrowing. It kept spending. It kept telling investors the peak was still years away. But the audience began to feel the strain. The average American household now subscribed to 4 streaming services and spent more than $100 a month on them. The remote control became a battlefield. The algorithm that once felt like magic now felt like a nag. People opened Netflix and saw a wall of posters they didn't recognize. They scrolled for 20 minutes and then turned on cable or TikTok instead. Churn, the metric Netflix had always kept secret, started to creep upward. Quietly, insidiously. A few percentage points here, a few more there. The company masked it with aggressive price hikes in wealthy countries and discount plans in poor ones. But the machine was starting to cough. And still, no one in power admitted the era of infinite growth was ending. Not the board, not the bankers, not the founder who had built his legend on seeing 10 moves ahead. They kept telling the same story. Just a little more time, just a few more markets, just one more quarter of acceleration, and the flywheel would spin forever. April 19, 2022 was the day the market stopped believing the story. When Netflix announced it had lost subscribers for the first time in a decade, it wasn't the number that caused the panic. It was the confession underneath it. The company warned that 2 million more would leave in the current quarter. It admitted password sharing was a bigger problem than anyone had admitted. It hinted, for the first time, that the golden age was over. The market heard something else entirely. It heard the words every growth stock dreads. Peak subscriber. And when the market hears peak, it doesn't wait for confirmation. It runs. $200 billion disappeared in hours, not because the business had changed overnight, but because the story had. The empire had not fallen. It had simply become mortal. And mortality, in the world of infinite growth, is the only unforgivable sin. The morning after the massacre, Reed Hastings did something no one had ever seen him do in public. He looked tired.
Not the calculated exhaustion of a visionary who claims to sleep is for mortals. Real, bone-deep fatigue. The kind that settles in when the myth you have spent 25 years building suddenly weighs more than the company itself. In the earnings call that triggered the collapse, his voice carried the flatness of a man reading his own obituary. He spoke of headwinds and macro factors and the post-COVID normalization. He used the phrase, "a lot to digest," 3 separate times. Analysts who once hung on his every syllable now typed sell recommendations before he finished the sentence. But the deepest cut came halfway through the call, almost as an afterthought. Hastings admitted that Netflix had been studying advertising for years. Advertising. The original sin the company had been founded to destroy. The late fees were gone, the commercials were gone, the entire promise had been purity. You pay once, you get everything, forever, no interruptions. Now, the prophet was preparing to drag a 30-second pre-roll across the screen, like a graffiti tag across a cathedral wall. Wall Street heard that admission and understood the unspoken truth. The growth model was broken beyond repair. If Netflix was willing to consider ads, the subscriber-only religion was dead. The only question left was how ugly the funeral would be. Inside the company, the mood swung between denial to rage to terror in the space of hours. Engineers who had been told they were changing the world now refreshed their stock accounts every 30 seconds and watched their net worth drop by 6 figures. Executives scheduled emergency offsites that no one believed would fix anything. The culture deck, that famous slide deck that once proclaimed freedom and responsibility, suddenly felt like a relic from a civilization that had vanished overnight. Yet the real betrayal was not the stock price. It was the realization that the leadership had known the cliff was coming and had kept driving anyway. Internal forecasts from as early as 2019 had warned that North American saturation was inevitable. Models had predicted the pandemic bump would reverse hard once vaccines rolled out. Memos had circulated about the coming content drought as studios pulled libraries home. None of it had changed the public story. Hastings and his co-CEO Ted Sarandos had continued to guide Wall Street toward ever higher subscriber targets. They had continued to authorize $17 billion content budgets while privately admitting half the shows would never find an audience. They had kept borrowing at negative real interest rates because the market rewarded delusion and punished honesty. The strategy had a name inside the hallways: extend and pretend. Extend the growth narrative one more quarter. Pretend the laws of economics were suspended for companies bold enough. It had worked brilliantly for a decade. It worked right up until the moment it didn't. Now the pretense was over, and the extension had become a noose. Netflix carried almost $20 billion in long-term debt, more than double what it owed in 2018. The interest bill alone was closing in on $1 billion a year. Every original series that flopped, every foreign market that refused to pay American prices, every household that canceled after finishing Stranger Things, all of it flowed straight to the bottom line like blood from an arterial wound. And the bleeding was about to get worse. In the weeks that followed the April massacre, the company began a series of decisions that felt less like strategy and more like a death row inmate choosing his last meal. 1,100 employees were laid off in 2 waves, roughly 10% of the workforce. Entire divisions that had been sacred cows for years, the Tudum fan site, the DVD.com remnant, the animation expansion, were slashed without ceremony. The gleaming new Hollywood office buildings suddenly had empty floors, echoing like mausoleums. Investors watched the carnage and demanded more. The stock kept sliding from $200 billion to $150 to $120. 100. Every attempt to stanch the bleeding only revealed how deep the wound went. The most humiliating moment came in July 2022, when Microsoft was announced as the chosen advertising partner. The company that had once mocked broadcast television as a dying dinosaur was now begging for scraps from the same table. The ad tier, when it finally launched months later, would be built and sold by the same corporation that powered banner ads on MSN in 1999. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. But perhaps the clearest sign that the old Netflix was gone forever came in the quiet cancellation of 100 beloved shows. Not just the low performers, fan favorites, critically adored series that had defined the
brand. The OA, Sense8, Glow, Santa Clarita Diet. One by one, they were axed with a form letter that felt written by algorithm. We've made the difficult decision. The message to the industry was unmistakable. Nothing is safe anymore. Not awards, not passion projects, not even cultural phenomena. Only cold spreadsheets mattered now. Hollywood felt the chill and pulled back. A-list talent that once begged to work with Netflix suddenly hesitated. Directors asked for gross points instead of upfront fees. Agents whispered that the checks were clearing slower than they used to. The aura was gone. The fear was gone. In its place was pity. And pity in Hollywood is the most dangerous emotion of all. By the end of 2022, the company that had once been valued higher than Disney was worth less than Paramount. The rocket had not just fallen to Earth. It had buried itself nose first in the dirt and kept going. And still, somewhere in the rubble, Reed Hastings insisted the story was not over. He spoke of a new chapter. Of multiple revenue streams. Of gaming and live events and advertising and consumer products. He spoke the way a general speaks after losing half his army, with the calm desperation of a man who knows the next battle will decide everything. But the world had stopped listening to visionaries who measured success in billions burned. The world wanted survivors. The empire had not collapsed. Not yet. But the golden age was dead, and everyone knew it. And the only question left was how much more would have to burn before something new could rise from the ashes. In the winter of 2023, the ashes began to glow again, but the light was colder, harsher, and unmistakably corporate. The ad tier launched in November 2022 with almost no fanfare, buried under Black Friday sales and World Cup coverage. 12 million people signed up in the first 2 months. By spring, the number had doubled. By fall, it had tripled. The cheapest plan in Netflix history, the one that forced viewers to sit through car insurance spots and burger commercials before watching a prestige drama, became the fastest growing offering the company had ever released. Wall Street exhaled. The stock stopped bleeding. For the first time since the crash, analysts began using the word stabilization. They did not say redemption. They did not say triumph. They said stabilization, the way doctors say it when a patient stops getting worse, but still needs machines to breathe. Inside the company, the transformation was brutal and total. The culture deck was quietly retired. The famous unlimited vacation policy survived only on paper. Expense reports were scrutinized line by line. Private jets were grounded. The Los Gatos cafeteria stopped serving free kombucha on tap. Employees who had once been told they were artists building the future of storytelling were now handed KPIs measured in minutes watched per dollar of ad spend. The content strategy flipped overnight. Shows that could not be sold to advertisers were canceled mid-season. Animated movies for children soared in priority because they pulled the highest CPMs. Live sports, once dismissed as legacy garbage, became objects of quiet obsession. The algorithm that had once been trained to maximize satisfaction was retrained to maximize watch time on platform. Engagement at any cost.
and the cost was steep. Password sharing, the practice the company had winked at for a decade, was declared war upon. In early 2023, households across America opened their apps to find a new prompt: verify this TV belongs to your household. The backlash was volcanic. Social media filled with screenshots of breakup texts triggered by the crackdown. Entire subreddits formed to share VPN workarounds. In Brazil, protesters burned Netflix envelopes in the street like draft cards. Netflix did not blink. It sent polite emails, then firmer ones, then began charging extra for additional homes. Millions paid. Millions more canceled. The company had run the numbers and
discovered that even if half the borrowers walked away, the other half would more than make up the difference. It was the coldest calculation in the company's history. And it worked. Revenue per user rose for the first time in years. By the summer of 2023, the company was adding subscribers again. Not the explosive pandemic numbers, not the conquest of new continents numbers, but steady, boring, profitable growth. The rocket was never coming back, but the parachute had opened. Investors rewarded the pragmatism the way they once rewarded the dream. The stock doubled from its low, then doubled again. By early 2024, Netflix was worth more than Disney for the first time since the crash. Analysts who had buried the company now praised its maturity. The same mouths that had called Hastings washed up now called him a genius for pivoting to advertising. But something essential had been traded away in the bargain. The red end still glowed on a billion screens, yet it no longer meant the same thing. It no longer meant escape from commercials. It no longer meant freedom from schedules. It no longer meant a sacred space where art could be made without interference. It meant another utility bill, another remote control choice, another company trying to sell you something between the moments you actually cared about. The audience felt the shift even if they could not name it. Viewing hours kept rising, but passion cooled. The cultural conversation moved elsewhere. TikTok owned attention. YouTube owned obsession. Twitch owned community. Netflix became the place you put on in the background while folding laundry or doom-scrolling on your phone. Reliable, adequate, forgettable. The company tried to fight the drift with spectacle. It spent $600 million for the rights to WWE Raw. It live-streamed a golf match between PGA and LIV players and a tennis exhibition featuring Nadal and Alcaraz. It bought the rights to Christmas Day NFL games. Each event was technically flawless and emotionally empty. Viewers tuned in, watched the ads, and left without ever feeling they had witnessed something historic. Even the content engine, once the envy of the world, began to stutter. The $17 billion budget was still the largest in history, but the batting average collapsed. For every Squid Game Season 2 or Wednesday, there were a dozen shows that premiered to silence. The algorithm had become so efficient at chasing trends that everything started to look the same. True crime, survival games, nostalgic reboots, dark thrillers lit like submarine corridors. The machine was no longer discovering culture. It was manufacturing it to spec. And still, the stock climbed. Because none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was average revenue per user, ad tier penetration, paid sharing monetization, content amortization schedules. The language of art had been fully replaced by the language of quarterly guidance. Reed Hastings stepped down as co-CEO in January 2023, handing the throne to Ted Sarandos and Greg Peters. He stayed on as executive chairman, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The founder who had built Netflix on a church was leaving before the collection plates came out. In his final letter to shareholders, he wrote, "We are becoming the company we need to be for the next 20 years." He did not say whether he liked that company. By 2025, Netflix had more than 300 million subscribers worldwide and generated more profit in a single quarter than it had in entire years during the growth era. The debt was under control, the ad business was scaling faster than anyone had modeled, the stock was within striking distance of its all-time high. From the outside, the resurrection looked complete. From the inside, it felt like a hostage video.
The empire had survived, but the dream that built it had been euthanized, quietly, painlessly, and with full shareholder approval. December 2025, the red N now glows on more than 330 million screens in every country that matters, in languages most Americans have never heard spoken. The company is worth $580 billion again, almost triple the ashes of that night in April 2022. The rocket never returned, but something steadier, colder, and far more durable has taken its place. Netflix is no longer the rebel. It is the establishment. It sells the most expensive advertising inventory on Earth. Its Christmas Day NFL games draw 50 million American households, more than any broadcast network has managed in decades. Its ad tier is the default choice in half the new markets it enters. Password sharing is a quaint memory, like late fees or Friday night trips to Blockbuster. The content pipeline is a factory of ruthless precision. Every show greenlit with an expected ROI spreadsheet attached. Every season renewal decided by a formula that weighs global watch minutes against amortized cost down to the penny. The world has accepted the new covenant. You pay less, you watch ads. You pay more, you share your living room with fewer strangers. You stay because leaving costs more attention than staying. The war is over, and Netflix did not win it by remaining pure. It won by becoming the least bad option in a world that ran out of better ones. Reed Hastings rarely speaks in public anymore. When he does, the fire is gone. The man who once said sleeping was for people without dreams now talks about operational excellence and capital allocation. He sold another $100 million of stock last quarter. No one blinked. Ted Sarandos and Greg Peters run the machine with the calm of surgeons who have learned to live with blood on their hands. They no longer promise to change the world. They promise mid-teens revenue growth and expanding margins. Wall Street gives them standing ovations for it. And yet, on quiet nights, in certain corners of the internet, you can still find the old religion. Forums where people trade.
Burned DVDs of canceled shows like Samizdat. Subreddits that archive the original House of Cards before the Spacey scandal forced its quiet removal. TikTok edits set to the old THX-style Netflix sound that make teenagers feel nostalgia for an era they never lived through. They remember a time when the red envelope meant rebellion, when a company told an entire industry it was wrong, and then proved it. When binge-watching felt like stealing fire from the gods. When a streaming service could still feel like a secret, dangerous, alive. That company is gone. It died somewhere between the first ad pre-roll and the first paid sharing surcharge. It died quietly, with lawyers present and shareholder approval unanimous. What stands in its place is stronger, richer, and utterly without illusion. It will never inspire a child to dream of making movies the way the old Netflix once did. It will never again make a studio chief wake up in a cold sweat. It will never again be loved. But it will never again lose $200 billion overnight either. The empire did not fall. It surrendered. It traded its soul for survival and discovered, to its own surprise, that survival was enough. In the end, the real story of how Netflix lost $200 billion in a single night is not a story of hubris or bad luck or even competition. It is the story of what happens when a revolutionary grows up and realizes the revolution must end so the bills can be paid. The rocket burned bright and burned out. The machine that rose from the crater will run for decades, maybe centuries, humming efficiently, profitably, indifferently. And somewhere in the hum, you can still hear, if you listen very carefully, the faint echo of a DVD sliding into a red envelope on a winter morning in 1998. The sound of a dream being born. The sound of a dream being mailed, first class, into history. It will never come again.